Welcome to Scoli Sleep Stories. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable, let the day soften around you, and settle in for a calm documentary made for curious minds. If these stories help you rest, learn, or simply enjoy a quieter part of the day, please consider liking this episode and subscribing to the channel. Now, when you are ready, let us begin. Chapter 1. Before Bridges, Meeting the River. Morning mist rests lightly above the river. Along the banks, reeds lean over quiet shallows, their narrow leaves holding small beads of water. Beneath the surface, rounded stones appear and disappear as the current passes over them. Some are pale, some dark, and some softened by a thin green covering of water plants. The river moves around them without hurry, following a course shaped over many seasons. Long before there were bridges of timber, stone, iron, or steel, people came to places like this and paused. A river offered much that was valuable. It provided water for drinking and cooking. Fish and water plants supplied food, while animals gathered near its banks. When a river overflowed onto nearby land, it could leave behind fine, fertile soil. The river itself could become a route for canoes, boats, and rafts. Even when people traveled on land, its winding line formed a recognizable path through forests, grasslands, and open plains. For these reasons, settlements often grew beside water. Homes stood within reach of the bank. Fields spread across level ground nearby. Paths followed the river toward other villages and distant regions. Yet the same river that guided a journey could also interrupt it. A person walking along one bank might see a field, a market, or a neighboring community on the other side. The distance across might not seem great. Voices could sometimes carry over the water. Smoke might rise from cooking fires opposite. But the direct path ended at the river's edge, and the traveler had to decide what to do next. The earliest answer was usually not to build, it was to observe. A traveler might walk slowly along the bank, studying the surface. Swift water often formed ripples and narrow creases. Deeper pools could appear dark, although reflections sometimes made depth difficult to judge. Wider sections were often shallower, because the flow had more room to spread. Where the river divided around a gravel bar or a small island, each separate channel might be easier to cross than the whole river in one place. Water near a bend might move more slowly. A narrow side channel might offer firmer footing. The traveler watched drifting leaves, ripples around stones, and the quiet lines where currents met. Every small sign helped to reveal what lay beneath the surface. The ground below the water mattered as much as the water itself. Firm gravel or stone could provide steady footing. Loose sand shifted under weight. A bed of rounded rocks might be secure in one place and slippery in another. To cross safely, people learned to read both water and ground. A shallow place where people or animals can cross a river on foot is called a ford. Fords were among the most important crossing places in the early landscape. Some may have been used by a single family traveling between a home and a field. Others became familiar meeting points for herders, traders, messengers, and groups of travelers. A reliable ford could shape the land around it. Footpaths converged there. Later, broader tracks followed. Settlements sometimes developed nearby, because many journeys already passed through the same place. Goods could be exchanged while people waited to cross, and a regular place of exchange might gradually become a market. In time, roads could preserve the memory of a ford, even after the crossing itself had changed, but a ford was never entirely fixed. Rain falling far upstream could raise the water, even beneath a clear local sky. Spring snowmelt from distant hills might deepen a river for days or weeks. During drought, the channel could become low and gentle, revealing stones that had long been hidden. Erosion might remove part of a bank. Gravel could shift during a season of strong flow, while silt settled into a passage that had once been firm. So knowledge of a ford had to be renewed. A crossing that had been easy last summer might require a different path this year. Travelers watched the water, spoke with people who lived nearby, and noticed the marks left by recent currents. They understood that a river was not a road of hard earth. It moved, and its crossing places moved with it. Animals could also offer clues. Herds sometimes followed familiar routes toward broad shallows. Tracks leading down a gently sloping bank suggested that the ground might be firm. Yet observation still required care. because the needs and abilities of animals differed from those of people carrying baskets, guiding children, or transporting goods. At smaller streams, the choices could be simpler. Natural stones sometimes formed a broken path from one bank to the other. A traveler could step from one dry surface to the next, pausing to find balance. In another place, a broad slab of rock might lie across a narrow channel. Roots could hold the banks firmly together. A fallen tree might rest above the flow, linking two sides without any human hand having placed it there. These natural crossings offered early lessons in structure. A stone stayed steady because it was broad and well seated. A tree reached across because its trunk was long enough, and because each end found support. People did not need special words for these ideas. They could feel them through their feet and see them in the landscape. The lesson was quiet and practical. A safe crossing depended on careful attention. It depended on the depth and speed of the water, the firmness of the ground, and the steadiness of whatever carried a traveler's weight. Rivers were not the only features that asked people to choose their routes carefully. Valleys and ravines interrupted paths as well. A valley might be green and gradual, with a stream winding along its floor, or it might have steep sides and a narrow bottom. To continue a journey, travelers could descend one slope and climb the other. They could follow a long route around the slope, or they could look for a narrow point where the gap might be crossed more directly. Each choice required a calm calculation of distance, time, ground, weather, and effort. A longer path might be easier. A shorter path might involve a steep descent. A narrow place might offer a direct crossing, but only if the ground on either side was secure. The landscape did not provide one answer for every traveler. A person walking alone might choose differently from a group carrying goods or guiding animals. Sometimes the best answer was not a fixed crossing at all. Boats and rafts carried people across broad or deep water long before permanent bridges stood there. Different communities developed watercraft suited to their local materials, waters, and traditions. Where crossings became regular, a ferry might carry travelers, animals, and goods back and forth along a familiar route. The history of crossing water is therefore larger than the history of bridges. Fords, boats, rafts, and ferries all belong within it. In many places, they continued to be useful even after bridges appeared. A bridge might serve one road, while boats could reach many points along the bank. A ford might remain convenient during a dry season. People chose the method that suited the river, the load, and the journey. It is impossible to identify the first bridge with certainty. The earliest crossings were probably made from materials that did not last. Wood decays, vines weaken, high water carries branches downstream. A useful log might be replaced many times, with each new trunk resting where an earlier one had been. Simple crossings could be washed away, repaired, or rebuilt, leaving few clear traces for later generations to find. There was probably no single morning when one person invented the bridge for everyone else. Human knowledge more often grows in many places, through repeated observation and shared experience. Communities faced their own streams, rivers, marshes, valleys, and ravines. They worked with the stone, timber, reeds, rope fibers, and tools available to them. Their solutions were shaped by local weather, terrain, trade routes, customs, and the journeys people needed to make. A forest community might learn from fallen trunks. People living near broad, gentle rivers might depend more on fords, boats, and ferries. In mountain country where water ran through narrow valleys, flexible crossings could answer a need that stepping stones could not. One tradition did not simply replace another. Different communities responded independently, and their ideas could develop, travel, mingle, and change. Bridge history is not a single straight line. It is more like a network of paths approaching many rivers from many directions. At the beginning of all those paths stood the landscape itself. The river was a patient teacher. It showed where the current pressed against a bank and where the water moved more slowly. It revealed how stones divided the flow. It demonstrated that a broad object could rest between two supports, and that roots could strengthen loose soil. Seasonal changes taught patience. Familiar crossings encouraged memory. Shared journeys invited cooperation. People returned to the same places and noticed what had changed. They remembered where gravel lay beneath the shallows. They watched for stones that had shifted after rain. They learned which banks offered a gentle approach and which paths became difficult when the ground was wet. Knowledge passed from one traveler to another, from one season to the next. Perhaps a family crossed together in the pale light of morning. One person stepped first, testing the stones. Another followed with a basket held above the water. On the far bank, they rested for a moment before continuing toward a field or settlement. Perhaps traders arrived later, leading the animals toward the same broad ford. They waited while another group crossed from the opposite side. At such a place, journeys met. News could be exchanged. Directions could be offered. The crossing became more than a point in the river. It became part of the shared map held in many memories. It flowed around stones, between reeds, and past the marks of feet along the shore. Sometimes it ran low and clear. At other times, rain or snowmelt deepened it. The people beside it adjusted their plans, because careful crossing began with accepting that the landscape could change. On a cool morning, a traveler follows a narrow path beside a stream. The water is clear enough to show brown pebbles beneath the surface. Ferns gather in the shade, and the banks draw closer together as the path enters a small grove. There, a tree has fallen across the channel. Its roots remain caught in the earth on one side, while its upper trunk rests firmly on the opposite bank. Water passes below it in a bright, steady ribbon. The traveler stops and places one hand against the bark. The trunk is wide, sound, and naturally positioned. For a moment it is simply part of the forest, but it is also a way across, and in time, people would begin to wonder whether such a useful crossing might be placed where nature had not happened to provide one. Chapter 2. The First Deliberate Crossings. The fallen tree offered more than a path across the stream. It offered an idea. Perhaps someone returned to that place many times, crossing carefully over the same broad trunk. Perhaps they noticed how securely one end rested among the roots, while the other was supported by the far bank. Then, beside another narrow stream where no tree had fallen, people may have wondered whether they could place a trunk there themselves. No one knows exactly where or when the first deliberate bridge was made. The earliest crossings were probably built from materials found close at hand: logs, timber slabs, stone steps, brushwood, woven fibers, reeds, vines, bamboo, leather, or combinations of these materials. Few traces of such bridges remain. Wood softens and decays. Plant fibers break apart. Rivers shift their channels, carry materials downstream, and cover old banks with fresh layers of sand and mud. Archaeological evidence is sparse, not necessarily because early bridges were rare, but because their materials were perishable. The absence of an ancient bridge does not mean that no bridge was there. It may simply mean that the crossing returned, slowly and quietly, to the landscape from which it came. A single log could be enough to cross a small stream. Choosing that log, however, required care. A branch that appeared strong on the forest floor might be hollow within. A fresh trunk could be heavy and difficult to move. A narrow trunk might bend beneath a traveler's weight. People learned to examine the wood, trim away troublesome branches, and look for firm resting places on both banks. A group might move a log by lifting it together, dragging it along the ground, or guiding it through shallow water. The work called for a shared rhythm. Hands took hold, feet moved slowly. Voices helped everyone lift, pause, and turn at the same moment. Once the trunk lay across the stream, someone tested it. At first, the crossing might be tried without carrying anything. A careful foot pressed against the wood. The trunk settled slightly into the bank. Another step followed, and then another. If the log shifted, the builders adjusted it. They might place stones beneath its ends, or fill a soft hollow with brushwood and packed earth. They could smooth the approach so that a traveler did not need to make an awkward step from the bank. In this way, the crossing became more than a fallen tree. It became a trunk deliberately chosen, placed, tested, and prepared. Elsewhere, where water spread thinly over a firm riverbed, people used stepping stones. Some stones were already present. Others could be carried or rolled into the stream and arranged at comfortable intervals. Stepping stones worked best where the water moved moderately and where the riverbed could support their weight. A stone resting on deep mud might slowly sink. During floods, even a large stone might settle, lean, or be moved, for flowing water has a patient and persistent strength. So a stepping stone crossing needed attention. After high water, people returned to inspect it. They reset a leaning stone or added smaller rocks around its base. Through repetition, they learned which shapes remained steady and which surfaces became slippery. They noticed where the current pressed hardest and where calmer water gathered behind each stone. Crossing such a path had its own measured pace. One foot found the center of a stone, The body shifted gently forward, then the next stone received the traveler's weight. A basket could be carried close to the body, while a walking staff touched the riverbed for balance. Each step joined the banks for only a moment, yet the line of stones made that moment repeatable, day after day. A log offered a continuous path, but it was narrow. Several logs placed side by side could create a wider surface. This surface on which people, animals, or vehicles travel is called the deck of a bridge. A wider deck was more comfortable, but it introduced another question. Round logs could roll. They might shift apart beneath a foot, or drift away when the water rose. The builders therefore needed a way to hold them together. In many places, the answer was lashing. A lashing is cord or fiber, wrapped tightly around separate pieces to hold them together. A fiber is a thin strand from a plant, an animal material, or in much later times a manufactured substance. Early builders used whatever their surroundings provided. They might strip bark into long flexible pieces, twist grasses together, gather vines, prepare leather thongs, or separate strong strands from reeds and other plants. The work was slow and repetitive. A length of cord passed over the logs, and then beneath them. It crossed itself and returned. Hands pulled it snug. Another turn followed the first, and then another. Each wrapping added firmness. The ends were secured, and the binding was tested. Turn, cross, pull, and hold. Then begin again. Cross pieces laid at right angles could help keep the logs together. Lashings could bind the crossing into a single deck rather than a row of separate trunks. The completed structure still needed watching, especially after rain or rising water. A loosened binding could be tightened. A worn length of fiber could be replaced. No single method was used everywhere, because landscapes did not provide the same trees, plants, stones, or tools. Builders worked with local materials and adapted their knowledge to a particular stream, a particular season, and a particular need. It is tempting to call such bridges primitive because they used few materials, yet that word does not fairly describe the thought and skill involved. A small local crossing could be highly effective for its place and purpose. If it carried people safely over a familiar stream, could be repaired with nearby materials, and suited the seasons of its region, then it answered its builder's needs very well. A bridge did not need to be large to show careful understanding. The same patient observation that helped people place and bind logs may also have led to crossings made from woven materials. A single blade of grass bends easily. A single strand of bark may snap, but many strands twisted or braided together can form a cord stronger than each strand alone. People could see similar forms all around them. Roots spread and intertwined through soil. Vines hung from branches. Baskets held their shape, because many narrow pieces had been woven together. By watching and working with such materials, people learned that separate fibers could share a load. The strength did not come from any one strand. It came from many strands supporting one another. Beside a river, people may have gathered reeds into bundles and laid them over wet ground. Vines could be selected for length and flexibility. Elsewhere, bamboo, bark fiber, grasses, or leather might be prepared. The materials varied from region to region, but the motions of the work were often similar. Fibers were gathered, cleaned, softened, twisted, braided, and joined. Fingers repeated the same calm movements: turn, cross, pull, and hold. A short length became a longer one. A few strands became a cord. Several cords could become a rope. Early rope or vine crossings did not necessarily resemble the broad suspension bridges of later centuries. Some may have been very simple. A line stretched across a channel could serve as a handhold beside stepping stones. A traveler might use loops, a hanging basket, or a narrow foot rope with another line above for the hands. In some places, a woven walkway could be suspended between the banks, with additional lines along the sides. Such crossings required confidence in both the cord and the points where it was secured. A strong rope was of little use if it was attached to something unstable. Builders therefore looked for firm anchor points and watched how the rope responded when weight was applied. If the fibers stretched, the line might need tightening. If one area began to fray, it could be wrapped or replaced. The crossing was not simply built and forgotten. Like the stepping stones and the logs, it remained part of an ongoing practice of inspection and repair. Testing was gradual. Someone might first pull on the line from the bank. Then a small load could be attached. Finally, a person crossed with careful feet, feeling each change in tension. The bridge moved a little, as flexible bridges still do. Movement alone did not necessarily mean that anything was wrong. With experience, builders learned the difference between a gentle, expected sway and a sign that the crossing needed attention. Most of this knowledge was probably not written down. It was preserved through repeated community practice. One person showed another how to choose a suitable vine. A child watched reeds being twisted into cord. Neighbors remembered which binding held well through rain and which bank remained firm when the river rose. The knowledge lived in hands, eyes, and shared memory. Each repair became another lesson. Each crossing offered another chance to observe. Each season added to what the community understood about wood, stone, fiber, and moving water. Over time, a small bridge became part of ordinary life. People carried baskets to the far bank. Animals were guided toward pasture. Tools and news passed between households. The crossing might be modest, rebuilt often, and known only to the people who used it. Yet it quietly shortened the journey and made the two sides of a stream feel less separate. Its builders may never have thought of themselves as engineers. Still, they were solving familiar engineering questions. What material was strong enough? Where should the crossing rest? How could separate pieces be held together? How would the bridge respond when a traveler stepped onto it, or when the water rose beneath it? The answers came through observation, cooperation, testing, and repetition. At another narrow channel, several straight logs now rested beside one another. Cross pieces lay across them. Lashings circled the wood in firm, even bands, holding the separate pieces together. Water moved below, while careful feet passed above. The crossing was wider than a single trunk and steadier than loose stones. It was already more than an imitation of what nature had provided. It was a structure shaped by shared knowledge and made for repeated use. And as the logs remained securely beside one another, a new question slowly began to take form. How might a crossing be made stronger, broader, and more dependable for an entire village? Chapter 3: Timber Beams and Village Craft. The question of making a crossing stronger did not belong to one person alone. It passed quietly through the village, from those who cut timber to those who shaped it, and from those who watched the river to those who traveled the road each day. A farmer knew how much weight a cart might carry. A miller knew when the stream ran highest. A carpenter understood the grain of wood. Others remembered where the bank had softened after rain, or where rising water had shifted stones along the channel. Together, such knowledge became a shared plan. At the heart of many timber crossings was a simple and useful form: the beam bridge. A beam is a structural member that carries weight across a gap. In its plainest form, a bridge might consist of one or more relatively straight timbers laid horizontally between firm supports. Smaller boards could be placed across them to form a level path for people, animals, and carts. The supports at the two ends are called abutments. An abutment might be made from stone, packed earth, heavy timber, or a careful combination of materials. It holds the end of the bridge and passes the bridge's burden into the ground. The distance from one support to the next is known as the span. Across a narrow stream, 2 abutments might be enough. Across a broader channel, builders could add intermediate supports called piers. These stood between the ends, perhaps in shallow water or along the floor of a valley. Instead of asking one timber to reach the whole distance, the piers divided the crossing into several shorter spans. This mattered because every wooden beam had its limits. The principle could be seen in a branch laid across 2 stones. With no load upon it, the branch might remain nearly straight. Place a basket in the middle, and it would dip gently downward. Move the stones farther apart, or add more weight, and the dip would deepen. Within the loaded branch, 2 kinds of force were at work. The upper part was generally under compression, which is a squeezing force. The lower part was generally under tension, which is a pulling or stretching force. Timber could endure both, but only within limits. If the span grew too long, or the burden became too heavy, the beam could bend excessively or eventually fail. Builders learned to respond in several practical ways. They could choose deeper or thicker beams. They could place several beams close together so that the load was shared among them. They could shorten the span by adding a pier, set braces beneath the crossing, or join shorter timbers into a larger supporting framework. These ideas did not have to begin as written formulas. They could be learned through patient observation, repeated work, and memory. A bridge that moved too much beneath a cart might need another beam. A timber that sagged after several seasons might be replaced with a deeper one. A pier that remained steady through high water could become the model for the next crossing. The choice of tree mattered as well. Straight trunks were useful because they could become long beams with relatively little shaping. Where dense and durable tree species were available, builders valued them for the most important parts of the structure. Yet timber traditions varied widely. Communities did not all possess the same trees, tools, weather, or customs. In some places, long trunks were plentiful. Elsewhere, shorter pieces had to be joined with particular care. A tree could be examined before it was cut. Its straightness, knots, and grain helped determine how its wood might be used. Once felled, the trunk was trimmed and shaped. Tools flattened its sides, divided wood into boards, and prepared the surfaces where one piece would meet another. Connecting those pieces required joinery, the craft of fitting wood together. A simple notch could allow one timber to rest securely upon another. Wooden pegs could pass through aligned holes, holding the pieces together without relying entirely on rope. A mortise and tenon joint used a projecting end, called the tenon, fitted into a matching opening called the mortise. Wedges could tighten a connection. Where builders needed to make one long member from shorter pieces, carefully shaped scarf joints allowed timber ends to overlap and join. In later work, iron straps or bolts could offer further strength. The names were less important than the care behind them. A well-made joint guided weight from one piece into the next. It limited unwanted movement and helped separate timbers act together as one structure. On a clear morning, the work might begin beside the road. Shaped timbers waited on the ground. Ropes had been arranged for lifting. Stones were already settled at the banks to form steady abutments. People gathered according to their skills and strength. Some pulled on the ropes, while others guided the rising timber. A carpenter watched its alignment. Other villagers waited nearby, ready with tools, pegs, and wedges. Children and elders might observe from a quiet distance as familiar pieces of wood became part of a larger form. One beam settled into place, and then another was positioned beside it. Cross pieces connected them. Boards formed the deck above. A low rail might be fitted along each edge. Wooden pegs entered their prepared holes with measured hammer taps, and the steady sound carried over the water. Little by little, the bridge became broad enough for someone carrying 2 baskets. It might be made strong enough for an animal, and later for a cart moving slowly toward the mill. What had begun as separate trunks, boards, stones, and wooden pins now formed a dependable path. Once opened, the crossing entered village life almost without ceremony. In the morning, grain traveled across it to be ground. Later, flour returned in sacks. People crossed toward fields, grazing areas, markets, neighboring settlements, and places of worship. Tools passed from one household to another. A craftsperson could reach a customer more easily. Families on opposite banks no longer needed to wait for low water before visiting. The bridge carried all these travelers, but it also carried its own weight. The deck pressed upon the beams. The beams passed their burden into the abutments and piers. Those supports transferred it onward into the earth and stones below. The bridge did not make weight disappear. Instead, it guided weight along a safe and orderly path, from the traveler to the deck, from the deck to the beams, and then through the supports into firm ground. That path had to remain sound through the changing seasons. Wood was strong and useful, but it remained sensitive to moisture, insects, sunlight, and decay. The outer portion of a trunk could shorten the life of an exposed timber. End grain, found at the cut ends where the wood fibers were open, could readily take in water. Moisture trapped around a joint might linger long after the rest of the bridge had dried. Insects could find shelter in softened wood. For this reason, care of the bridge became part of the village year. Leaves and mud were cleared away, loose pegs were tightened, worn boards were replaced, water was guided away from vulnerable joints. After high water, people examined the banks and piers. They looked beneath the deck for signs of sagging, trapped dampness, or decay. A well-maintained timber bridge was rarely unchanged. Over many years, one beam might be replaced, and then part of a railing. Later, several deck boards might be renewed. Another generation could strengthen a joint with an iron strap or rebuild an abutment with carefully placed stone. Many long-lived timber bridges therefore contained pieces from several different periods. Their history did not rest in a single moment of construction. It continued through repair, replacement, and patient attention. Such bridges endured because people returned to care for them. In places where rain or strong sunlight threatened important timbers, builders sometimes placed a roof over the crossing. A covered bridge might look like a long, narrow house resting above a stream, yet its roof served a practical purpose. It sheltered the main structural wood from rain and sun, helping it remain dry and extending its useful life. Boarding along the sides could provide still more protection. Some covered bridges also became sheltered public spaces. Neighbors paused beneath the roof to exchange news. Travelers waited there while a shower passed. Baskets or other goods could be set down for a moment, safely out of the weather. The bridge remained part of the road, yet for a little while it could also feel like a shared room above the river. And so, during gentle rain, the character of the timber bridge became especially clear. Drops sounded softly upon the roof. The beams remained sheltered beneath it, their joints secured by pegs, wedges, and years of careful repair. A cart rolled slowly over the boards toward the mill. Its wheels made a low and measured sound, while the stream passed below in a smooth, unhurried current. Beyond one open end of the bridge lay wet fields and grazing ground. Beyond the other stood the clustered roofs of the village. The crossing joined them with timber chosen from the surrounding landscape, shaped by familiar hands and maintained through the work of many seasons. Yet wood, even when selected wisely and sheltered well, had limits. Builders looking toward wider rivers and deeper valleys began to consider another material, one that was heavier, harder, and patient beneath the weather. As rain continued to murmur on the covered roof and water moved quietly below, they wondered whether stone, carefully shaped and patiently fitted, might cross a greater gap and remain there for generations. Chapter 4: Stone and the Discovery of the Arch. In a sheltered workyard beside the river, the morning air was cool, and pale stone dust rested lightly on the ground. Blocks of rock stood in orderly rows. Some were rough, still bearing the uneven surfaces left by the quarry. Others had been shaped with care, their sides flattened beneath hammers and chisels. Each measured strike made a quiet, clear sound. Then came the softer fall of dust. Stone offered builders a special kind of patience. A carefully chosen block could remain in place through the steady passage of years. Yet stone brought difficulties of its own. It was heavy to quarry, heavy to transport, and slow to shape. Every block required effort, and every movement had to be considered. The simplest stone bridge was much like the simplest timber bridge. Builders could place a flat slab from one support to another, creating a beam. Across a narrow stream or drainage channel, this method worked well. A large stone might rest on firm banks or on upright supports while travelers crossed the level surface above. But a stone beam could not easily reach across a wide opening. A long slab of sufficient size was difficult to obtain and harder still to move. Its own weight pulled downward through the middle. Stone was strong when squeezed, but it was vulnerable when bent. A hidden weakness or a small crack could spread under the strain. The qualities that made stone feel solid and enduring also made a long, slender stone beam impractical. Builders needed another form, one that worked with the nature of the material rather than against it. Over many generations and in more than one place, they learned how a collection of smaller stones could cross a space that no single stone could span alone. The answer was the arch. The arch was not a sudden invention belonging to one named builder or one particular city. Ancient builders used arches before the rise of Rome. Knowledge accumulated gradually through craft, geometry, observation, and repair. One generation noticed which forms remained firm. Another adjusted the curve, strengthened a foundation, or refined the shape of a stone. The arch developed through a long and patient conversation between human hands, heavy material, and the downward pull of weight. Its strength came from cooperation. The stones in an arch were not simply rectangular blocks. They were shaped like wedges, narrower on one side and wider on the other. Each wedge-shaped block was called a voussoir. Set side by side around a curve, the voussoirs leaned gently into their neighbors. No stone crossed the entire opening. Instead, each one pressed against the next, and the whole line of stones worked together. The weight of the masonry squeezed the stones against one another. This squeezing force is called compression. Masonry, whether made from stone or brick, performs especially well in compression. Rather than asking a long slab to resist bending, the arch carried forces around its curve and toward the supports on either side. One might imagine a quiet circle of hands, each resting steadily against the next. No single hand holds the entire circle together. Its stability comes from the way all of them meet. At the highest part of the arch was the crown. Lower down, on each side, was the springing. This was the point where the arch began to curve upward from its support. Between the two springing points, the voussoirs formed a continuous arch ring. Near the crown, builders often placed a central stone laid in the work. This was the keystone. It helped to complete and lock the arch ring. Because of its central position, it became an enduring symbol of unity and support. Yet the keystone did not carry the bridge alone. Every voussoir contributed. So did the firm structures at either end. An arch was not one heroic stone resting above many lesser stones. It was a complete arrangement, with every part sharing in the work. That arrangement carried weight downward, but it also pushed outward. As force traveled around the curve, the arch delivered an outward and downward pressure to its supports. This force is called thrust. If the supports were too weak, they could shift apart. Builders therefore made strong abutments at the ends of the arch. An abutment is the solid support that receives and resists the thrust. When a bridge had several arches, the piers between them also needed to receive these forces and carry them safely toward the ground. Beneath everything lay the foundations. They needed stable ground, because even a beautifully cut arch could not remain settled if the earth below it moved. Near a river, finding firm ground was especially important. Builders might clear away loose material, lay broad courses of stone, or choose a place where more dependable ground could be reached. The visible curve received admiration, but its lasting strength began below, where passing travelers would rarely look. The arch depended upon the quiet steadiness of its foundations. Before any voussoir could press securely against its neighbors, however, the unfinished stones needed temporary support. An incomplete arch could not yet carry itself. Builders made a wooden framework beneath the future curve. This framework was called centering, or sometimes falsework. Carpenters shaped ribs of timber to match the intended form of the arch. Planks crossed between the ribs, creating a steady surface on which masons could place the stones. The curve itself was prepared with care. Builders laid it out with cords, measuring rods, wooden templates, and full-size marks made on prepared surfaces. Simple tools could produce precise work when they were used patiently. A cord could guide the shape of a curve. A template allowed the same form to be checked again and again. Measuring rods helped keep the two sides in agreement as the work slowly rose. Upon the centering, the first voussoirs were placed near the springing points. The masons then worked gradually upward from both sides. Each shaped stone found its place against the one below it. The stones leaned gently into their neighbors, though the timber still carried them, while the arch remained incomplete. The curve climbed slowly above the wooden frame. One course followed another. Measurements were checked, surfaces were adjusted, and the two sides approached each other near the crown. Then the remaining central stones, including the keystone, were set into position. The arch ring was complete, but the timber remained beneath it. Now came one of the most careful stages. The centering had to be removed, so that the finished arch could begin carrying its own weight. The carpenters did not simply pull the wooden framework away. Supporting wedges were eased little by little. The centering descended gradually, allowing the stones to settle against one another. The wooden curve and the stone curve seemed almost to touch. The masons watched. The carpenters waited. The weight shifted slowly from the temporary frame into the completed ring of stone. Then a narrow line of daylight appeared between timber and masonry. The stones remained overhead. Their weight now passed from wedge to wedge, around the arch into the abutments and down through the foundations. The centering could be dismantled and perhaps used again for another opening. What had been a temporary framework of timber became an open passage for water, road, or air. Above the arch ring, builders formed the body of the bridge and the surface of the roadway. In some bridges, the space above the curve was packed with solid fill, including earth, rubble, and masonry. This material supported the crossing above. In other bridges, builders included additional openings. These openings reduced the amount of weight resting above the main arch. Near a river, they could also allow more water to pass. The arrangement varied according to the landscape, the available material, and the needs of the crossing. Not every old stone opening that appeared stepped or curved was a true arch. Some builders made what is called a corbelled opening. In a corbelled structure, horizontal courses of stone projected a little farther inward with each rising layer. The gap became narrower until it could be closed at the top. Corbelling could create useful passages in covered spaces, but its stones did not work together in the same way as wedge-shaped voussoirs. A true arch gained its special character from the continuous line of compression passing through its curve. Each wedge leaned gently into the next, and the whole arch carried its weight toward the supports. Once this principle was understood, the arch offered many possibilities. A single curve could cross a stream, a row of arches could carry a road across a broad river or a low valley. Many smaller stones, quarried, measured, and shaped by many workers, could accomplish what one immense stone slab could not. The form grew through accumulated knowledge. Builders observed completed arches and repaired older ones. They learned where foundations needed to be stronger, where abutments needed greater weight, and how carefully the curve had to be laid out. Craft and geometry met in the workyard, among cords, rods, templates, timber frames, and pale stone dust. Late in the day, the chisels grew quiet. Dust settled around the tools, and the river reflected the muted color of the new masonry. Beneath the completed arch, the wooden centering had been eased away and stacked on the bank. Water moved through the opening, framed by a curve that seemed both simple and deeply considered. Each wedge leaned gently into its neighbors. The crown rested above the current. The springing points stood firm upon their supports, the abutments received the outward thrust, and the foundations held quietly below. Nothing in the bridge worked alone. In centuries to come, builders would repeat this form across long distances. They would measure it, refine it, and place it along organized roads leading from town to town. From this settled arch beside the river, the way now opened toward the roads and crossings of the Roman world. Chapter 5. Roman Roads and Lasting Arches. From this settled arch beside the river, the road extended outward through fields, over low hills, and toward villages and distant towns. Along such roads, the builders of the Roman world carried an old and useful body of knowledge. The Romans did not invent roads, bridges, arches, or concrete. Earlier Mediterranean cultures had already developed methods of masonry, surveying, and road building. Roman engineers inherited these practices. They studied them, adapted them to different landscapes, and applied them on a remarkably large and organized scale across the Roman world. A bridge was rarely considered by itself. It belonged to a road, and the road belonged to a wider landscape of farms, ports, settlements, and administrative centers. Roman bridges supported many kinds of movement. Officials and messengers crossed them. They enabled military travel, supported trade and communication, and made ordinary local journeys more dependable. An ox cart carrying jars of oil might follow the same paved route as a farmer walking toward a nearby market. Letters, tools, cloth, grain, and news all passed over the same stones. Each bridge became a quiet link in a much larger chain of roads. Before a visible arch could rise, however, builders had to understand the land and the river. Surveyors went ahead with measuring rods. They observed the height of the banks, the width of the water, and the shape of the surrounding ground. They considered how a road would approach the crossing and how it would continue on the other side. The gradient of the road was especially important. A gradient is the steepness of a road. It needed to remain practical for people on foot, animals carrying loads, and carts moving slowly on wooden wheels. Roman roads are sometimes imagined as perfectly straight lines drawn across the landscape without regard for hills or rivers. Many followed direct courses where that was sensible, but they were not universally straight. A road might curve around difficult ground, follow a ridge, descend gradually toward a valley, or seek a place where the riverbanks and riverbed offered better support. Roads and bridges were adapted to local terrain. Once a suitable crossing had been chosen, the most demanding work often began below the future roadway. Foundations had to carry the weight of piers, arches, paving, parapets, travelers, animals, and carts. They also had to resist the steady movement of water. A beautiful arch resting on an uncertain base would not remain secure for long, so the foundation came first, even though much of it would later be hidden beneath stone, soil, and flowing water. Whenever possible, builders worked during periods of low water. The shallower current made the riverbed easier to reach and gave laborers more room to work. In other places, they built temporary timber enclosures, resembling what we now call cofferdams. A cofferdam is a temporary enclosure used to control water around a construction area. Timbers could be driven into place, and gaps could be packed as well as conditions allowed. Inside the enclosure, the current might be calmed or diverted, and some of the water could be lifted or drained away. The result was not always a perfectly dry space. It was simply a quieter and more manageable place in which builders could prepare the riverbed and set stone, rubble, timber, and cement with care. In some regions, Roman builders used hydraulic cement made from lime and volcanic material such as pozzolana. Pozzolana is a volcanic material that can react with lime to make hydraulic cement. This kind of cement can harden through reactions involving water, which made it useful in damp foundations and other places close to rivers. There was no single recipe followed everywhere. Materials differed across the empire, and methods varied as well. Builders adjusted their mixtures according to the lime, stone, volcanic material, and other resources available nearby. Roman hydraulic cements differed in composition and quality from one region to another. Their usefulness came from patient experience with local materials, water, and time. When the foundations were ready, the piers and abutments could rise. These solid supports prepared the way for the familiar curves above them. Many Roman bridges used repeated semicircular masonry arches. A semicircular arch forms half of a circle. It rises from one support, reaches its crown, and curves downward to the next. A row of these arches gave a long bridge a calm and orderly rhythm. Pier, and curve carried the roadway gradually across the water. Yet the stones of an arch could not support themselves while the curve was still incomplete. Carpenters first constructed temporary wooden centering beneath the future arch. This timber framework held the intended shape, while masons worked above it. Carefully cut stones were laid over the centering, beginning near the supports and rising inward from both sides. Chisels tapped against stone. Mallets sounded gently across the riverbank. Pale dust and small fragments settled around the tools, while the wooden frame waited beneath the growing curve. When the arch was complete and its stones pressed securely against one another, the centering could be eased away. The weight then passed through the curve toward the piers and abutments. The abutments at the ends of the bridge received the outward force of the outer arches and joined the crossing firmly to the banks. The piers between the arches were often massive, but their shape also mattered. On the upstream side, many had projections called cutwaters. A cutwater is a pointed or rounded extension on a pier that divides the current and guides water around the masonry. Instead of meeting a broad, flat surface, the river parted at the cutwater. Water curled along both sides of the pier and gathered again beyond it. The shape could ease the pressure of the moving current. On some bridges, cutwaters continued upward and created wider places along the roadway where travelers might pause while carts passed. Builders also considered the changing height of the river. Water that seemed quiet and low in one season might rise and spread more widely in another. Some larger bridge structures included additional openings that allowed high water to pass with less pressure against the main masonry. These features showed that builders understood a river as a changing presence. It was not a fixed line through the landscape. It rose and fell, pressed against foundations, curled around piers, and carried its current steadily beneath the arches. Above the arches, layers of carefully placed material created a stable roadway. Stone paving provided a durable surface for feet, hooves, and wheels, while parapets marked the edges of the crossing. From the roadway, a traveler might look down and see the current moving between the piers. Sunlight rested briefly upon the cutwaters. Ahead, the road continued beyond the opposite bank, climbing gently toward fields, roofs, and the next distant settlement. The scale and organization of Roman bridge building can still be sensed in remains at places including Cordoba, Merida, Alcantara, and Rome. Yet the word Roman must be used with care. The amount of original Roman material differs from one bridge to another. Many bridges called Roman have been repaired, widened, partly rebuilt, or reconstructed during later centuries. Their foundations may be ancient, while some arches above them are newer. A roadway may have been renewed many times. Parapets, paving, and other parts may belong to different periods. Their survival, then, is not always a story of stone remaining completely unchanged. More often, it is a story of continuing care. Long after the first Roman surveyors, carpenters, and masons had left the riverbank, other workers arrived. They examined old piers, replaced loosened blocks, renewed worn paving, and strengthened arches. Where necessary, they rebuilt portions of a crossing so that the road could continue to serve the people who depended upon it. One arch might contain work from several periods. A parapet could belong to one century, a repaired curve to another, and a foundation beneath them both to a much earlier age. This does not lessen the history of the bridge. It deepens it. The crossing endured because generation after generation continued to find it useful. Each repairer entered an old and patient conversation between stone, water, road, and community. The first builders created a practical structure. Later hands cared for it and allowed it to remain part of the living landscape. In the evening, the many arches rested in long reflections upon the river. Some stones were pale, others had darkened with weather, while newer blocks sat quietly among older courses. Water divided at the cutwaters, curled around the piers, and gathered again downstream. An ox cart moved across the paving at an unhurried pace. Its wheels followed a road shaped by surveyors, laborers, carpenters, masons, and centuries of caretakers. Beneath it, foundations remained hidden in the riverbed, still carrying the visible bridge above. Beyond the far bank, the road entered a town whose roofs gathered close around the crossing. In the centuries ahead, bridges there would become more than passages over water. Houses and workshops would stand upon them. Gates, chapels, and market stalls would line their narrow ways. The bridge would become a street, and the street would become a small neighborhood, held quietly above the flowing river. Chapter 6. Bridges of Medieval Towns. At dawn, the bridge awakened a little before the streets around it. Pale light settled upon the stone parapets. Below, the river carried the colors of morning in long, wavering bands. Above, wooden shutters opened one by one. A baker lifted the bar from a shop window, and the warm scent of bread drifted into the cool river air. Farther along, a leather worker arranged belts and small pouches near a doorway. There were gentle traces of timber, beeswax, wool, smoke, and damp stone. Bells sounded from a nearby tower, their measured notes passing over roofs and water alike. Soon, footsteps began to cross the paving. Some belonged to travelers going from one bank to the other. Others belonged to residents with only a short distance to walk, perhaps from a room above a shop to a neighboring workshop. A cart rolled carefully between the buildings. A porter carried a bundle toward the market. At one end of the bridge, an official prepared to collect the day's toll. A toll is a payment required to use a road or crossing. Depending on local custom, it might be asked of travelers, carts, animals, or goods. The money could help repay the cost of construction or provide funds for later repairs. Stonework needed attention. Timber wore away. Paving shifted beneath wheels and hooves. Floods left marks upon piers, and winter frost opened small spaces in mortar. A useful bridge was never simply built and forgotten. Arrangements for funding a bridge varied from place to place. A ruler might provide money or grant permission to collect tolls. A town might oversee the work. A monastery or charitable foundation might contribute, while merchants and craft organizations could also offer support. These craft organizations were often known as guilds. A guild was an association connected with a craft, trade, or profession. In this way, a medieval bridge could belong to many parts of town life at once. It was a road, but it might also be a toll station, a defensive point, a market, a religious place, and even a neighborhood. At the entrance to some bridges stood gates or towers. These helped the town control who and what entered. They could provide places for guards and toll collectors, making the crossing part of the town's defenses. The bridge was important because roads naturally gathered there. Anyone wishing to cross the river was guided toward the same narrow route. Yet the bridge was not only a guarded boundary. It could also be a place of welcome. Travelers encountered familiar signs of food, trade, shelter, and worship. A merchant arriving after a long journey might pause to buy bread. A pilgrim might visit a chapel. A villager could meet a neighbor from across the water without traveling far into the town. Bridge chapels were places of worship built on or beside bridges. Their purposes differed. They allowed travelers to pray before or after a journey, and some were connected with charitable institutions. In certain places, gifts made to a chapel could also support the crossing itself. Religious care and practical maintenance were sometimes joined. A candle lit for a peaceful journey might stand inside a chapel, whose arrangements helped masons attend to worn stones nearby. On bridges important enough to attract steady traffic, market stalls and shops sometimes appeared. Space within a town was valuable, and a bridge already carried a regular stream of possible customers. Traders did not need to call travelers from distant streets. People passed close beside their doorways. There might be the scent of fresh bread, polished leather, warm wax, or newly cut timber. Cloth could be folded upon a counter. Small useful objects might be set where the morning light reached them. Commerce became part of the crossing, with buying and selling woven gently into the movement between the two riverbanks. Some bridges eventually supported whole rows of buildings. Upper stories might project beyond the stone roadway, held by timber frames. Rooms looked down toward the river, where changing light moved beneath beams and foundations. These bridge houses have become one of the most memorable images of medieval towns, although they were not typical of every medieval bridge. Most crossings did not carry entire neighborhoods. Many remained open roads with parapets, gates, or perhaps a small chapel. Where buildings did rise, the bridge became a remarkably layered place. Beneath it flowed the water, across it ran the road, beside the road stood shops, and above the shops were rooms used for storage, work, and family life. A person could wake, prepare goods, open a shutter, and begin the working day without leaving the crossing. All this activity required regular care. Market goods and buildings added weight. Crowds could slow carts and make movement difficult. Sanitation had to be considered. Timber structures needed protection from fire, and the river continually pressed upon the foundations below. Town officials, residents, guilds, bridge wardens, and craftspeople dealt with such matters as practical parts of daily life. Medieval towns were not all alike, nor were they uniformly dirty, careless, or technologically stagnant. Their people understood that bridges needed skilled labor, clear arrangements, funding, and repeated attention. Solutions were not always perfect, but builders continued to adapt what they had inherited. They repaired arches, strengthened piers, replaced wooden parts, and adjusted buildings as the needs of the town changed. The most famous bridge neighborhood in medieval England stood across the River Thames in London. The great medieval stone version of Old London Bridge was begun in the late 12th century. Construction continued for several decades, and the bridge was completed around 1209 to 1212. It had roughly 20 narrow arches, although the number varies depending on how the openings are counted. Upon the bridge stood houses, shops, gates, and a chapel dedicated to Thomas Becket. At one period there was also a drawbridge section. A drawbridge is a movable section that can be raised or shifted. From the roadway, Old London Bridge may have felt like a long and narrow street. Buildings stood close on either side, sometimes leaving only small glimpses of water through openings and doorways. Signboards hung above the shops. Windows caught the afternoon light. Beneath them, the tidal Thames moved between the piers. Protective structures surrounded the piers, helping them withstand the river. Yet these structures, together with the narrow arches, restricted the flow of the Thames. Currents near the openings became fast and complex, especially as the tide changed. The bridge altered the movement of the river, even as the river continually tested the bridge. For centuries, Londoners repaired and modified the crossing. It did not remain fixed in one medieval form. The buildings upon Old London Bridge were removed during the 18th century, and the medieval bridge itself was demolished in the early 19th century. By then, London required a different kind of crossing. Still, the bridge's long history showed how thoroughly such a structure could become part of urban life. Farther south in Florence, another shop-lying bridge crossed the river Arno. The present Ponte Vecchio dates from the 14th century. Its stone arches carry a roadway bordered by shops, while openings between the buildings provide views along the river. Like Old London Bridge, the Ponte Vecchio changed over time. The elevated Vasari corridor, passing above part of the bridge, was added in 1565, after the medieval period. Shops and other features were altered in later centuries. Its present appearance therefore reflects several periods, rather than one unchanged medieval design. The bridge is not a sealed picture of a single year. It is a structure shaped by continued use. That gradual shaping was common. A bridge might begin as a civic project and later acquire a chapel. Shops could gather near its entrance and then spread along the roadway. A gate might be rebuilt, a roof replaced, or a pier strengthened. Each alteration answered a need. There might be a desire for more room to trade, safer passage for travelers, income for repairs, or better access between growing neighborhoods. The bridge connected not only two banks but many kinds of work. Masons tended its stone, carpenters looked after its timber, merchants depended upon its traffic, while residents relied upon the road beneath their windows. Toll collectors, charitable foundations, monasteries, rulers, towns, and guilds could all take part in the long task of supporting a crossing. No single arrangement applied everywhere. One bridge might be closely tied to a chapel. Another might be maintained mainly through tolls. A third could depend upon a town, a ruler, local traders, or a combination of several groups. The bridge endured through cooperation, adjustment, and the patient acceptance that useful structures require continued care. As evening approached, the commerce of the bridge softened. Goods were carried inside. Wooden shutters folded closed, and the fragrance of wax replaced the stronger sense of the market. A final cart crossed toward the town gate. Bells marked the hour while the river darkened beneath the arches. Soon candlelight appeared in the windows of the bridge houses. Each small square of gold hovered above the water, joined below by an unsteady reflection. The bridge remained a road, a line of homes and workshops, a place of worship, a toll point, and a work of engineering, all resting together upon patient stone. Beyond those glowing windows, rivers continued through many other landscapes. They crossed broad plains, passed beneath wooded hills, and descended from distant mountains. Along their banks, communities across Asia developed distinct bridge traditions suited to local stone, timber, rope, climate, terrain, and need. And so the path widened beyond the towns of Europe. It followed rivers and mountain trails toward other graceful ways of reaching the farther side. While behind it, candlelight rested in bridge house windows, and the dark water moved quietly below. Chapter 7. Graceful Forms Across Asia. Beyond the candlelit bridge houses of Europe, rivers continued beneath other skies. Some moved slowly across broad plains, carrying pale reflections of clouds. Others passed through green valleys where rain softened the wooded hills. Farther inland, mountain streams descended between high walls of stone. Their water ran clear and cold, turning around boulders, roots, and quiet banks of grass. Across Asia, bridge builders worked within many different landscapes. There was no single Asian style of bridge, just as there was no single kind of river to cross. Local forests offered particular kinds of wood. Hills provided stone of differing strength and grain. In warmer regions, bamboo and cane could be cut, woven, and bound. Elsewhere, communities developed traditions of ironworking. Rainfall, floods, snow, mountain gorges, broad rivers, roads, and cultural practices all helped shape the bridges people made. Each form grew from its own surroundings. Each crossing belonged to its setting. On the North China Plain, in what is now Hebei Province, a low stone arch spans the Xiao River. This is the Jiaozhou Bridge, also called the Anji Bridge. It was built around the years 595 to 605 during China's Sui dynasty, and it is traditionally associated with a builder named Li Chun. At first glance, the bridge appears calm and simple. Its roadway rises only gently toward the center. Beneath it, one broad arch passes over the river. The curve is flatter than the round arches familiar from many Roman bridges. This shape is called a segmental arch. A semicircular arch forms half of a circle. A segmental arch forms less than half, so it appears shallower, spreading outward in a long and restrained curve. At Jiaozhou, this flatter arch allowed the builders to carry the roadway across a span of about 37 meters, without raising it far above the surrounding land. The road could therefore meet the bridge with a gradual approach. Travelers, carts, and animals did not have to climb toward a steep central crest before descending on the other side. The stone seems to reach across the water in one measured gesture, yet the main arch is only part of the design. Above it, in the space between the curved arch and the roadway, there are smaller openings. This makes Jiaozhou an open spandrel bridge. The spandrel is the area between an arch and the road resting above it. In a solid spandrel bridge, this area is filled with masonry. In an open spandrel bridge, openings remove some of that stone. At Jiaozhou, the smaller openings serve more than one purpose. They reduce the amount and weight of the masonry carried by the main arch. When the river rises, they can also provide additional passages for floodwater. The bridge does not simply stand against the river. Its design gives the moving water a little more room. Jiaozhou Bridge is the oldest surviving large open spandrel segmental stone arch bridge. Its long life reflects durable stone, thoughtful geometry, and the care of many generations. Its builders understood how shaped blocks could press against one another, passing their weight through the arch and down toward the ground. They also considered the height of the roadway, the changing level of the river, and the amount of material the bridge would require. Seen in quiet light, the bridge's ingenuity does not call loudly for attention. Grass rests beside the approaches, water passes beneath the wide central opening, and when it rises high enough, through the smaller arches as well. The structure seems settled into the plain, as though its long curve had been found within the landscape. From this low stone crossing, the path turns toward the wooded provinces of Fujian and Zhejiang. Here, another Chinese bridge tradition took shape through timber. Traditional wooden arch bridges in these regions use interwoven beams, arranged so that many separate pieces cooperate across a stream or valley. Their strength does not depend upon one uninterrupted length of wood. Instead, it comes from a carefully fitted pattern in which each timber supports and is supported by others. Builders use mortise and tenon joints to bring the pieces together. A tenon is a projecting part shaped at the end of one timber. It fits into a matching opening called a mortise, tut into another. When the work is accurate, the two parts meet closely, and one piece of wood holds its neighbor in place. Such a joint may look simple after it has been completed, yet making it well requires patience. A craftsperson must notice the grain, the direction of the fibers, the hardness of the timber, and the small changes caused by moisture. Hands learn to recognize what eyes alone might miss. A surface may not be quite level. A tenon may press too tightly. A beam may have a natural curve that should face in one direction rather than another. The knowledge lives in measurement, observation, and touch. It can be heard in the rhythm of tools and seen in the quiet pause before two pieces are joined. These wooden bridge traditions are living heritage. They do not survive only in old timbers. They continue through instruction, maintenance, repair, and rebuilding. Experienced builders teach younger craftspeople through words and drawings, but also through shared work. They select material together, mark lines, shape joints, and test the finished fit. In this way, the bridge is renewed, and so is the knowledge that made it possible. Across the sea in Japan, bridge builders also developed many forms. Some crossings were simple timber beams, others were roofed crossings, arched tinder structures, or bridges supported by members projecting outward from the banks. A projecting support of this kind is called a cantilever. It is anchored or supported at one end, while the other end extends into open space. It may be imagined as a firm branch reaching outward from the trunk of a tree. Japanese bridges should not all be pictured as decorative garden features. Many were practical parts of roads, towns, temple routes, and rural life. Their designs responded to available timber, local carpentry, river conditions, and the kinds of traffic expected to pass across them. At Iwakuni, the Kintaikyo crosses the Nishiki River in 5 spans. It was first built in 1673. Of its 5 spans, 3 are prominent wooden arches, resting on stone piers. They rise in a repeated rhythm above the river, with shorter end spans joining them to the banks. Floods and other damage led to repeated rebuilding. Yet rebuilding a timber bridge does not necessarily make it culturally inauthentic. Wood weathers, rivers change, joints loosen, and individual pieces eventually need replacement. Continuity may remain in the design, the choice of materials, the specialized joinery, and the communal practice of renewing the crossing. At Kintaikyo, preservation has therefore meant more than keeping every old piece untouched. It has also meant preserving the knowledge needed to make the bridge again. Measurements, patterns, tools, and working methods carry memory from one generation to another. A craftsperson studies the work of earlier builders, learns its proportions, and understands how its timbers meet. In time, that craftsperson passes the same knowledge onward. The renewed bridge is both old and new. Its identity rests partly in its materials, but also in its design, methods, place, and purpose. Beneath the wooden arches, the river continues to change with the seasons. Above them, footsteps follow a familiar curve, shaped and reshaped by patient hands. Far to the west, the land rises toward the Himalayas. Here, deep valleys and swift rivers created different conditions. A crossing might have to reach between steep banks, in a place where broad stone arches or river piers were difficult to build. Mountain communities used what their surroundings provided. They crossed with logs, bamboo, cane, rope, and timber cantilevers. Later, iron chain suspension systems offered another way to carry a path over the water. These highland bridges were not all alike, nor should they all be imagined as precarious threads hanging uncertainly above a gorge. Some were substantial works, built and maintained by communities with deep knowledge of the landscape. Their makers understood how ropes stretched, how wood weathered, how anchors held, and how a bridge moved beneath the measured passage of people and animals. In the 15th century, the Tibetan Buddhist teacher and bridge builder Tengtong Gyalpo became widely associated with iron chain bridges in Tibet and Bhutan. Iron chains could be anchored on opposite sides of a river or gorge, allowing the crossing to hang between them. This form was useful where building piers in deep, fast water would have been difficult. The iron links worked together in tension. They carried the suspended path while their anchors transferred its pull into the banks. Timber and rope could complete the crossing, providing a surface for travelers moving between one side and the other. In Bhutan, bridge building could carry religious meaning as well as practical value. Helping people cross an obstacle might be regarded as a virtuous act. A bridge allowed travelers, pilgrims, farmers, and neighbors to continue their journeys. It shortened difficult routes and connected communities divided by a river or gorge. A person approaching such a bridge might first hear the water below, then the softer sounds of rope, timber, leaves, and footsteps. The crossing was not separate from the mountain landscape. It moved within the air of the valley and rested against stone chosen to hold it. The exact histories of many old chain bridges are not always certain. Components could be reused, replaced, moved, or preserved separately after a crossing changed. Dates remembered in tradition may not identify the age of every surviving piece. A chain might endure while the deck beneath it was renewed many times. Sections of an older bridge might later find a place in another crossing. Here, as in the timber traditions of China and Japan, the life of a bridge did not always depend upon untouched original material. Continuity could rest in purpose, design, skilled work, and communal care. Iron links, timber planks, woven ropes, and stone foundations each had their own period of usefulness. Communities kept the bridge alive by watching, repairing, replacing, and teaching. Across these varied landscapes, graceful form arose from practical understanding. The low stone curve of Zhaozhou answered the conditions of a broad river plain. Interwoven beams in Fujian and Zhejiang drew upon local timber and inherited craft. The arches of Kintaikyo preserved specialized joinery through repeated renewal. In the Himalayas, rope, cane, bamboo, timber, and iron chains helped communities cross steep valleys and swift water. These traditions did not form one single story or style. They belonged to distinct places and cultural practices, yet each showed the same patient attention to material and setting. Stone answered pressure, timber revealed its grain, rope stretched, iron carried tension. Builders listened to those qualities and worked with them. In a timber workshop, a craftsperson might run a hand slowly along a beam, feeling its surface before easing a tenon toward its mortise. The joint would be tested by touch, adjusted, and tested once more. High in the mountains, cool air might move through ropes, leaves, and the open spaces between iron links. Each material answered in its own quiet way. Before long, however, iron would be produced in new quantities and shaped in expanding workshops. Beyond the forests, rivers, and high valleys, furnaces began to glow. The sound of hammers and workshops would carry into another age of bridge building, when iron began to change the distance that a single span could cross. Chapter 8. Iron Changes the Span. In a wooded gorge in western England, the River Severn moves between steep green slopes. Mist sometimes rests above the water, softening the trees and turning the farther bank into a quiet shape. Paths descend toward the river, passing stone walls, cottages, and places where the earth has long been worked for clay, coal, and iron ore. From somewhere beyond the trees comes the measured sound of a forge, It is not the sound of the whole landscape, only one part of it. There is the breath of a furnace, the steady rhythm of tools, and the movement of people carrying fuel and material. Here around Colebrookdale, generations of workers learned to produce iron in growing quantities. Their work belonged to a broad period of change now called the Industrial Revolution. Iron itself was not new. For centuries, craftspeople had used it for tools, nails, straps, clamps, hinges, chains, and other useful objects. Earlier bridges sometimes included small pieces of iron to strengthen timber joints or bind stones together. The important change was not the sudden discovery of a material. It was the increasing ability to make large quantities of iron, shape substantial pieces, and imagine those pieces carrying the weight of an entire bridge. Above the Severn, dark gray ribs rise in a single arch. They curve from one wooded bank to the other, spanning about 30 meters, or 100 feet. Between them are smaller iron members, arranged with the care and rhythm of a great framework. This is the Iron Bridge, widely recognized as the world's first major bridge constructed primarily from cast iron. Its setting is gentle now. Leaves move near the river, birds cross the open air, and the arch is often framed by pale mist. Yet the bridge grew from a landscape of furnaces, mines, workshops, roads, and waterways. Its story is one of new production meeting older knowledge. The bridge was designed by Thomas Farnells Pritchard, an architect who understood buildings and decorative forms. Its construction was carried out under Abraham Darby III, a member of a family closely connected with iron-making at Colebrookdale. The great iron ribs were erected in 1779, and the bridge opened to traffic in 1781. No major crossing like it had been built before. Still, its builders did not abandon everything they already knew. When people begin working with a new structural material, they often shape it according to familiar ideas. A mason thinks of arches, a carpenter thinks of posts, braces, pegs, and carefully fitted joints. The iron bridge brought these habits together. Its overall form is an arch like the stone arches used for many centuries. An arch carries much of its load through compression, the force that presses material together. And so, the broad curve gave the unfamiliar material a familiar and practical task. Cast iron is made by heating iron until it becomes molten or liquid with heat, and then pouring it into a mold. As the metal cools, it hardens into the shape of that mold. This method allows repeated parts to be produced with carefully formed outlines. A rib, plate, bracket, or fitting can be cast before it reaches the building site. Such parts are described as prefabricated. The word simply means that pieces are made beforehand, then transported and assembled where the structure will stand. This approach became increasingly important in industrial construction. Workshops could prepare parts in controlled surroundings, while workers beside a river or valley fitted those parts together. Yet cast iron has limits. It is strong when squeezed under compression, but it is less dependable when pulled in tension or struck by a sudden shock. It is also relatively brittle. A brittle material may crack or break with little bending beforehand. A green branch bends noticeably before it parts. A brittle object gives much less warning. Early iron builders had to understand such behavior through observation, calculation, craft knowledge, and experience. They did not possess all the modern methods later used to analyze structures. Instead, they approached the new material through forms and skills they already trusted. This can be seen in the joints of the iron bridge. Although its members are metal, many connections resemble timber carpentry. Some are shaped like dovetail joints, in which a widening end helps prevent a piece from pulling free. Others resemble mortise and tenon joints, where one shaped part fits into an opening in another. Wedged connections also appear, recalling the way a carpenter might tighten a wooden frame. The resemblance is more than decorative. It shows skilled people carrying knowledge from one material into another. One might imagine a craftsperson studying a wooden joint and observing how its surfaces meet. Then, slowly, the craftsperson considers how a similar connection might be cast in iron. The result is neither entirely old nor entirely new. It is a patient adaptation, formed at the edge of changing possibilities. The bridge's 5 main ribs were assembled from cast sections. Their curved lines appear light when compared with a heavy masonry arch. Iron allowed builders to use slimmer members than many structures made from stone. More open space could remain between the supports, and through the framework, the sky, river, and opposite slope were still visible. There are uncertainties within the bridge's history. The exact furnace in which every component was cast is not known. Colebrook Dale and the surrounding district contain several places connected with iron production, and surviving records do not answer every question. A bridge may stand clearly in the landscape, while some details of its making remain softened by time. It is also important to remember that the iron bridge was not the first bridge to contain iron. Chains, fastenings, reinforcing pieces, and other metal components had appeared in earlier crossings. Its distinction lies in scale and purpose. Here, cast iron became the primary structural material of a major bridge, carrying the roadway across the gorge through an almost entirely metallic arch. Nor did iron immediately replace timber and stone. Wood remained abundant, workable, and well understood. Stone continued to offer durability and strength in compression. Builders chose among materials according to cost, availability, distance, climate, local skill, and the kind of crossing required. Timber, masonry, and metal continued to share the work of bridge building. Even within the broad name of iron, there were important differences. Cast iron and wrought iron were not the same, and each behaved in its own way. While cast iron is poured in liquid form into molds, the word wrought means worked. Heated iron is hammered or rolled, gradually becoming longer or taking on a chosen form. Traditional wrought iron contains slender, fibrous inclusions of slag, a glassy remnant from iron making. These inclusions can give the material a grain-like quality. Wrought iron generally performs better than cast iron when pulled in tension or subjected to bending. Rather than being shaped mainly by pouring, it could be forged into bars, links, plates, and other long forms. This made it especially useful for ties and chains, and later for many bridge parts in which forces pulled along the length of a member. The distinction mattered. Cast iron could perform well in an arch, where compression was dominant. Wrought iron could serve more reliably where a component was stretched. Builders gradually learned to place each material where its qualities were most useful. Iron and steel must also be kept distinct. They are not interchangeable terms. Both materials are based on iron, but differences in composition and manufacture give them different structural properties. Steel would later make possible bridge members that were lighter, stronger, and more dependable. In the early period represented by the iron bridge, however, cast iron and wrought iron were the principal metals, changing the builder's choices. Those choices were changing alongside transport itself. Canals carried coal, ore, and finished goods. Mines reached farther into the land. Furnaces produced increasing quantities of metal. Roads connected workshops with towns and ports. Later, railways extended across the countryside and required bridges capable of carrying concentrated loads along fixed routes. The growth of industrial bridges followed these developments. Better transport carried materials to construction sites, while expanding industries created a need for more crossings. A bridge might serve a road beside a furnace, a canal near a mine, or a railway approaching a manufacturing town. Production and transport changed together, each supporting the other. Still, on the banks of the Severn, these broad developments can be understood through one quiet structure. The iron bridge does not appear to reject the past. Its arch recalls masonry, its joints recall timber, its cast sections belong to the furnace and mold. It is a meeting place of old craft and new production. A traveler crossing it in 1781 might have heard wheels passing over the roadway and the river moving below. The dark ribs would have seemed both recognizable and strange. Here was an arch, yet not a stone arch. Here was a fitted frame, yet not one made from wood. Through the open spaces between the members, the wooded gorge remained close on either side. As the years passed, builders learned to use metal with increasing confidence. They studied where it could be compressed, where it could be pulled, and how separate pieces could be joined. They made slimmer members, repeated parts, and structures that carried weight with less solid mass. But the change did not arrive in a single leap. It proceeded gradually through bridges, like this one, where familiar forms offered a calm path into unfamiliar material. Timber did not disappear from the landscape. Stone arches did not cease to cross rivers. Instead, iron joined them. Each material continued to answer a different need. Stone carried pressure through solid curves. Timber could get cut, fitted, and repaired by practiced hands. Cast iron emerged from molds in repeatable shapes. wrought iron could be drawn outward into bars, ties, and links. This was how bridge building often advanced. One form did not simply erase another. New methods grew beside older ones, and sometimes revealed their possibilities more clearly. The fitted iron joints above the severn preserved the memory of wooden frames. The iron arch preserved the enduring logic of masonry. Around them, mines, furnaces, canals, roads, and railways carried the story onward. Today, the iron bridge rests above the river Severn, its gray ribs curved against the soft air. Mist drifts beneath it, and its metal joints still echo the hands and ideas of older timber craft. The bridge remains both industrial and graceful, substantial and open, new for its age, yet deeply connected to what came before. From this arch, the story of metal reaches farther outward. Wrought links can be joined into chains. Fine wires can be gathered into cables. Instead of rising as a firm arch from the banks, metal can hang in a long and gentle curve between distant supports. And so, following the river beyond the mist, the next crossings begin to take shape.